Well, hello, everybody. It's late there. It's early in the morning in Washington, and we're delighted to have a chance to join you. I guess this is the last session, and I want to congratulate you for the splendid success that you've had with this global town hall. It's really remarkable, and you've given all of us a new bar to try to reach. Congratulations. It's a real privilege for me today to really to talk with and interview Joe Nye. Joe is, I think, without question, the foremost academic theoretician about foreign policy over the last 50 years in America. And more concepts have been brought to popular understanding through Joe's work and his insights. It's a real privilege to have him on with us today. So let me start, Joe, if I could. Thank you for joining us, Joe. Let me start. You know, these last 4 years of U.S.-China relations, have had some real ups and downs. We now have a new president-elect, Joe Biden. What do you think will be President-elect Biden's approach to China?
Well, I think you're seeing the worst U.S.-China relations we've seen in about 50 years. But some of that has been the idiosyncrasies of President Trump. There was a fire burning that was based on China's behavior, particular trying to put the playing field against others. And Trump was like a man who threw gasoline on the fire. So his particular personality exaggerated it. I think when Biden takes office, you're going to remove that personal factor, but you'll have more predictability, a more civil tone. But some of those underlying problems are still going to be there. Theft of intellectual property, subsidies to state-owned enterprises, militarization of artificial islands in the South China Sea. Those issues are going to be there. So I think you're going to have a somewhat better tone and more predictability in U.S.-China relations. But I don't think we're going back to, let's say, 20 years ago or even 10 years ago.
Joe, let me ask, if I may. These 4 years have been really unusual in one sense. I mean, President Trump really broke with kind of a 50-year tradition of presidential perspectives on international relations, and he really asserted an American nationalism. That his primary goal is to just advance America's interests. And he really was not very supportive of alliances or partnerships or international organizations. Joe Biden, clearly has stated just the reverse. He is kind of a traditionalist. But this is a very divided country. America's very divided. What do you think President Biden can really do with such a divided country at this stage?
Well, I think he'll be able to do a fair amount of restoring international cooperation. In my recent book, Do Morals Matter? President's Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump, I argue that Trump is unique in 70 years, not 50 years, as turning his back on what's called the liberal international order. Biden, as you say, is very much grew up in that order. He was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee through much of it. I think that there'll be many problems that Biden will have to face. He can't reverse the clock entirely, but I think you're going to go back to that major tradition that we've had for 70 years. And if you look at the public opinion polls, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs poll showed that 70% of Americans wanted international cooperative foreign policy. And that's one of the highest numbers that we've seen in those polls since they started in 1974. So I think that Biden's propensity is there, and I think he has public opinion. He has room to work on.
Joe, let me take our focus to Asia, and historically, America's not an Asian country, but it's a Pacific country, and And we engaged Asia largely through bilateral treaty arrangements with some countries, and then partnership with others. And then we've worked and tried to participate through ASEAN, et cetera. In the last several years, something has emerged called the Quad. This is the sort of collaborative structure, on and off. It seems to be a bit more on now, between India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. How do you think the Quad becomes a primary feature going forward, and how would it be expanded if other countries wanted to join this?
Well, Richard Armitage and I have issued reports on the U.S.-Japan security arrangement about every 4 years, and we're about to issue another one in December. And we do pay tribute to the Quad, the idea of in security cooperation of broadening beyond the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty and the alliance, and including coordination with India makes sense. But you have to be careful in terms of institutional structures. India does not want an alliance. They're proud of being independent in that sense. So there'll be a good deal of cooperation that can be done with India, but it won't be like the US-Japan or the US-Australian alliance. And trying to make it a NATO for East Asia or something of that sort would, I think, be a mistake. But the ability to coordinate with India is there. After all, India has to have a concern about the growth of Chinese power. Indian soldiers were just killed by Chinese soldiers on the border in the last month or so, part of this wolf warrior diplomacy we've seen. So India is in a mood to cooperate, but not in a mood to sign a formal alliance.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Joe. On the South China Sea, both the Obama administration and the Trump administration have, said that they are opposed to Chinese unilateral island building and assertion of sovereignty in the region. But aside from freedom of navigation, exercises, it doesn't seem that we have a particularly clear strategy for dealing with this. What are your thoughts?
Well, on the military side, I think we have two things going for us. One is that we have the capacity, the naval capacity, to demonstrate the freedom of navigation operations that China cannot unilaterally assert these claims to the sea. The other thing we have going for us is the fact that the law of the sea tribunal in The Hague came down on the view that China was acting illegally. And what we can do diplomatically is recruit more countries to the position that China is the odd country out on this. It cannot turn this sea into a Chinese lake just by pouring sand on a bunch of rocks and reefs and atolls. So the fact that we have not just the naval capacity, but the diplomatic potential is there. We've got to do more with that diplomatic potential. The other thing we have to do, frankly, is do more in engaging the region in trade. One of the things that Armitage and I recommend in the new report we're bringing out is that the U.S. should rejoin the TPP, now CPTPP, and become more engaged in trade in the region.
Yes, Joe. We've got only about 5 minutes, but I would like to devote it to, to the question of Hong Kong and Taiwan, and they are now, I think, related. I think American attitudes have shifted fairly dramatically about China because of what's happened in Hong Kong. Now, we're not a signatory. The agreement was between Britain and China, not with the United States. But obviously, the world is looking at us about Hong Kong. What are your thoughts about what can be done here?
Well, China has clearly gone back on an international agreement, in this case with Britain. And we had basically endorsed that agreement through several administrations. We weren't formal signatories, but we were essentially people, a country that thought it was a good idea. And that's been pretty well violated by the Chinese. I think we've been critical. I think the argument that you can have sanctions against particular officials who are engaged in repression makes sense. The other thing we can do is follow the British lead, which is to admit people who from Hong Kong who want to come to our country for refugee status or asylum. But I think those are measures that we can take, and this dimension, I don't disagree very much with what Trump has done.
Joe, we have just a few minutes left, but I'd like to turn and to get your thoughts about Taiwan then, because the experiences with Hong Kong have clearly shifted the landscape in Washington in thinking about Taiwan. And the rather benign future that was, kind of envisioned 20 years ago doesn't look very benign. And it looks like we're seeing a rising focus on Taiwan and America's commitments to Taiwan. There are some rumors in Washington that Secretary Pompeo may make a final visit as Secretary of State to Taiwan. Obviously, that would be pretty dramatic. Could you share with us your thoughts about Taiwan and America's role with Taiwan and how it might figure over the next several years?
Well, the position across several administrations has been no unilateral declaration of independence by Taiwan and no use of force by mainland China, and that within the boundaries of that broad box, let the two sides negotiate the relations across the Taiwan Strait. The problem we see is that China's strength has grown and they're putting increased pressure on Taiwan. And under the Taiwan Relations Act, we are take seriously the security of Taiwan. So I think there'll be efforts made in the next administration. I don't know what Pompeo will do, but efforts in the next administration indicate that we take seriously the second half of that equation, which is no use of force by the mainland. And that may require us, in terms of defense assistance to Taiwan, to take a number of steps. But we don't want to violate the first half of that proposition, which is that we're not turning to support for Taiwan's independence, because that would be a casus belli and a provocation beyond what we want, which is a long-term status quo in which someday we hope that China will change enough that Taiwan may be able to reach a reasonable agreement with it. So holding the status quo, but it will require us to take a somewhat tougher position on the deterrent side of no use of force by the mainland.
Joe, this has been really a splendid set of comments, and I certainly have benefited from it. I'm sure all of our listeners have as well. And I think we've probably properly set the stage for the panel that is to come. So, Joe, let me, on behalf of all of the listeners, say thank you to you for taking the time to be with us. And then let me turn now to Greg Poling. Greg, you're going to take it forward with the panel discussion, I believe.